choice chain on the University of Toronto campus, and what choice chain is where you hold images of first trimester abortions and you dialogue with typically university students on the street about the laws in Canada. And I will never forget this one woman. She was probably about in her mid-30s, and she had a stroller with a toddler. And she walked by my sign, and she stopped, and she said, "Well, why are you doing this?" And so I explained to her my motivations for doing this, to protect preborn human life and to try to get laws changed in Canada. And at a certain point while I was talking, this young lady started crying. And she said to me, "But you have no idea how difficult it is to be a mother, and it's so tough. And this should be a woman's right to be able to choose to do this because it is so difficult, and some women have no support." And at the time, I remember, of course, being very taken aback. But I remember, and I regret it to this day, that the first initial thought that came into my mind was, I can't believe this woman. She is so selfish. It cannot be that difficult to be a mother. And then 2 months ago, I gave birth to a child. And I tell you this story because until a couple of months ago, I had not thought of this woman since our encounter. And as soon as I was in the hospital for quite a long time. I had a C-section, and after a 36-hour labor. And as soon as I was getting ready to come into the C-section, I had thought of this woman. And I thought, what an awful, awful hypocrite and an awful, awful person I am to have thought that thought. We have an obligation to protect preborn human life, and that is incredibly important. That is our primary goal. But we also have an obligation to mothers and to the crosses that they are going through. I think oftentimes in the pro-life movement, and I will only speak for myself, so as not to be any more hypocritical than I've already been in the past. But we need to do more to support young ladies in distress. There are so many organizations out there that are dying for our time, our treasure, or our talent. And by you all being here today, that is the first step. I guarantee that you are probably all very much involved in the pro-life community, in your local churches, and that is a wonderful thing. But I think that there is some truth, and please don't misunderstand me when I say this, when there are young ladies who also come up to me on the street when I'm doing street activism and say to my male colleagues, "Well, you're a man and you have no idea what it's like to be a woman, and so you can't talk about abortion." And of course, to an extent, that is silly. That is silly. Of course, we all have a say in talking about how we can best help all of our brothers and sisters. But yet there is not so much a kernel of truth, but a kernel of potential wisdom in a lesson for compassion and empathy. I didn't know what it was like to be a mother, and being a mother for, I suppose, about a year now, even though my baby was only born 2 months ago, that it is difficult to understand, it is difficult to empathize, and being involved in the pro-life movement since a little child, when my parents brought me to 40 Days for Life, I have realized that it is difficult to understand. And so my prayer today is that as we pray for the women and the children who go into the clinic, that for the next portion of the 40 Days for Life community, we also pray for our own personal fortitude, that we are able to do a little bit more because we can, because we know the truth, because to whom much is given, much is expected. And so we know the truth. And for those who don't know the truth, when they stand before God, they will be much, much less culpable than we ourselves are. And so we must remember that. And so what I ask today is definitely take up Margie's suggestion to knock on your neighbor's door who have kids and give that mom a rest. I hope some of my neighbors do that for me, because I definitely need it. And I am married. My husband is on parental leave. My in-laws, my parents, and our siblings basically moved in with us for a month before the baby was born. I have support coming out of my ears. And yet I still sometimes, when I find a quiet moment, put my head in my hands and I cry because I am exhausted. And maybe that sounds silly, maybe that sounds selfish, but it's true, and it is difficult, physically, emotionally. And so as we continue these 40 days, keep in mind to pray again for the women, the children, and our own personal fortitude. And I do ask, Margie mentioned so many organizations. She said what we have to do. I mentioned time, treasure, and talent. Please give what you can where you're at. Give a little more than you maybe can or ought, because my father taught me something. He said, generosity is not generous unless it hurts, unless you give up something for it, because otherwise it's not generosity, it's just an afterthought. So if you think you can't make a donation because funds are tight, maybe you forego that Tim Hortons coffee in the morning. If you think, I have no time, I have too many things to do, maybe you forego a 6-hour Netflix marathon and go and volunteer somewhere. That's probably more directed at the young people in the audience. And your talent, we all have so many talents in differing and varying degrees. Dig deep and figure out what your talent is and offer it up for the Lord. If you can, schedule in an extra hour on Monday, I believe Wanda said, where there's no one to stand here. And I'm sure Wanda has many pamphlets with pregnancy helplines and hotlines to give to these women. And I ask you, having once been a sidewalk counselor in Toronto, that if angry people approach you on the street, as I'm sure they have, if women in distress approach you on the street, instinctually we are meant to rebut. We want to rebut in our minds. That's our instinct. Try to listen. Offer up a prayer for the person you are speaking to. And really listen.